The morning sun painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the rolling hills of Silver Creek Ranch. Jake Morrison stood on the weathered porch of his modest homestead, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had grown cold while he watched the horizon. At his feet, a lean border collie mix named Rusty lifted his head, sensing the tension that had settled over his master like morning frost. Jake had built this ranch from nothing more than hope and determination 15 years ago, when he was barely 22 and foolish enough to believe that hard work and honest living were enough to guarantee a man's success. The land had been cheap because it was harsh, unforgiving territory that had broken more dreams than it had fulfilled. But Jake had seen something in the wild beauty of Silver Creek, in the way the water carved its path through the valley, in the endless expanse of grass that bent before the wind like an ocean of green. Those early years had been the hardest of his life. He'd built the cabin log by log, his hands bleeding and his back aching as he worked from dawn until dusk. The first winter nearly killed him, huddled in a half-finished cabin with gaps between the logs that let in the bitter Colorado wind. He'd spent nights lying awake, listening to wolves howl in the distance, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Snow piled up against the walls until it reached the windows, and he'd had to dig tunnels just to reach the makeshift barn where his 3 horses waited out the storm. Food had been scarce that first year. Jake survived on rabbits he shot with his father's old rifle, wild berries he gathered in the brief summer months, and the occasional fish he could pull from Silver Creek when it wasn't frozen solid. He'd learned to make coffee from roasted acorns when real coffee ran out, and he'd sewn patches onto his clothes until they were more patch than original fabric. But somehow he'd endured. Spring had brought new hope and renewed determination. Jake had finished the cabin, added a proper roof that didn't leak, and chinked the walls with mud and moss until they kept out the wind. He'd planted a small garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables from soil that seemed more rock than earth. Slowly, painfully, he'd begun to build something that resembled a real homestead. The cattle came next, a small herd of longhorns he'd driven up from Texas with the help of 3 other men who'd taken their pay and moved on to other opportunities. Those first cattle were wild and stubborn, more like deer than domestic animals, but they could survive on the harsh grassland where gentler breeds would have starved. Jake spent his days in the saddle, learning to read the land and the weather, understanding which valleys offered shelter from winter storms and which hillsides provided the best grazing. Year by year, the ranch had grown. The single-room cabin became a proper house with a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and coffee, a sitting room where Jake could read by lamplight on winter evenings, and a bedroom with a real bed instead of a pile of blankets on the floor. The cattle herd expanded from that initial group of 40 head to nearly 200 prime animals that grazed contentedly in the valley. He'd built fences and corrals, a barn that could shelter 20 horses, and a bunkhouse for the hands he hired during busy seasons. But it was the little things that made Silver Creek Ranch feel like home. The vegetable garden that now produced enough food to last through the winter, the apple trees he'd planted behind the house, their branches heavy with fruit every fall. The porch swing where he'd sit in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains while Rusty dozed at his feet. These were the details that transformed a piece of land into something worth fighting for. Jake had never married, though he'd come close once. Sarah Patterson had been the school teacher in the nearby town of Clearwater, a pretty woman with intelligent eyes and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. They'd courted for nearly 2 years, taking long walks along the creek on Sunday afternoons, sharing quiet conversations about books and dreams and the future they might build together. Jake had even bought a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had cost him a month's earnings from a cattle sale. But Sarah had wanted things that Silver Creek Ranch couldn't provide. She'd wanted to live in town, to have neighbors and social gatherings, and the security of knowing that help was never more than a shout away. She'd wanted children, lots of them, and a school where they could get a proper education without having to ride 20 miles through potentially dangerous territory. Jake had tried to compromise, had offered to build a house in Clearwater and hire a foreman to run the ranch, but something in him had rebelled against the idea of leaving the land he'd carved from the wilderness. The conversation where they'd finally admitted their differences had been one of the most painful of Jake's life. Sarah had cried, and he'd felt like crying too, but they'd both known that neither of them could change enough to make the other truly happy. She'd married the bank manager 6 months later, and Jake had thrown himself into ranch work with a dedication that bordered on obsession. That was when Rusty had come into his life, a half-starved puppy that had wandered onto the ranch during a particularly brutal winter storm. Jake had found the little dog huddled against the barn door, shivering in near death from cold and hunger. The pup's ribs had been visible through his thin coat, and his eyes had held a desperate intelligence that reminded Jake of his own struggles during those first hard years. He'd brought the puppy inside, fed him warm milk and scraps of meat, and nursed him back to health by the fire. For weeks, the little dog had slept on a blanket beside Jake's bed, too weak to do more than lift his head when Jake approached. But gradually, strength had returned to the small body, and with it had come a personality that was both independent and utterly loyal. Rusty had grown into a magnificent dog, sleek and intelligent, with a coat that shifted from brown to red to gold depending on the light. His border collie heritage showed in his intense gaze and his instinctive understanding of how to move cattle, but there was something else in his bloodline that gave him the courage to face down wolves and the intelligence to solve problems that would have stumped other dogs. The dog had proven to be worth his weight in gold as a cattle dog, with an instinct for herding that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bloodline. He could move a stubborn steer with nothing more than a steady stare, and he'd never lost a single head of cattle to predators or straying. But more than that, he'd become Jake's constant companion in a life that could be overwhelmingly lonely. On long nights when the wind howled across the plains and the cabin felt too small to contain Jake's restless energy, Rusty would curl up beside his chair, a warm presence that reminded him he wasn't entirely alone in the world. When Jake rode out to check on the cattle, Rusty ran alongside his horse, covering twice the distance with his back and forth scouting, but never showing signs of fatigue. When Jake worked in the garden or repaired fences, Rusty found a shady spot nearby where he could keep watch while staying out of the way. The dog seemed to understand Jake's moods better than most people did. When Jake was troubled by problems with the cattle or worried about money, Rusty would stay close, offering silent comfort with his presence. When Jake was happy, perhaps because of a successful cattle sale or a particularly beautiful sunset, Rusty would bound around the yard with infectious enthusiasm, his joy mirroring his master's good spirits. Now as Jake stared out at his land, he knew that everything he'd built was about to be put to the ultimate test. Word had reached him 3 days ago that the Garrett gang was headed his way, intent on taking his cattle and burning him out like they'd done to half a dozen other ranchers in the territory. The news had come from Tom Bradley, a neighboring rancher who'd ridden hard to spread the warning before fleeing with his own family to safety in Denver. Most folks had packed up and fled when they heard the Garretts were coming. The Henderson family had abandoned their homestead so quickly that they'd left behind furniture and personal belongings, taking only what they could carry on horseback. The Mitchells had tried to drive their cattle to safety, but the gang had overtaken them on the trail, stealing the animals and burning their wagons. Old Pete Kowalski had tried to make a stand at his trading post, and they'd found his body 3 days later, the building nothing but charred timbers and ashes. Those who survived the gang's attention were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and bitter memories of years of work reduced to nothing in a single night of violence. The territorial authorities seemed powerless to stop the outlaws, who moved too quickly and knew the country too well to be caught by conventional law enforcement. Jake had sent his remaining hands away with orders to spread word to the territorial marshal, though he doubted help would arrive in time. His foreman, Carlos Mendoza, had argued with him about staying, insisting that the ranch wasn't worth dying for. But Jake had been firm in his decision. He'd given each man a month's extra pay and a fast horse, and he'd watched them ride away with a mixture of relief and regret. The nearest law was 2 days' hard ride away, and the Garretts weren't known for their patience. If Jake was going to save his ranch, he was going to have to do it himself, with nothing but his rifle, his revolver, and the loyal dog at his side. The Garrett gang was led by a man named Samuel Garrett, a former Confederate soldier who'd turned to outlawry after the war ended, and left him with nothing but bitterness and a talent for violence. According to the stories Jake had heard, Garrett had been a sergeant in the Army of Northern Virginia, a competent soldier who distinguished himself in several battles before being wounded at Gettysburg. But the war had changed him, left him with a hatred for authority and a belief that the world owed him something for the suffering he'd endured. After the surrender at Appomattox, Garrett had drifted west like so many other former soldiers, looking for a new start in a land that promised opportunity for those willing to work for it. But unlike men like Jake, who'd found purpose in building something from nothing, Garrett had discovered that taking what he wanted was easier than earning it. He'd started small, robbing stagecoaches and isolated travelers, but his ambitions had grown along with his reputation. Now he rode with 7 other men, all of them desperate characters who'd found that following Garrett's lead was more profitable than honest work. There was Miguel Santos, a Mexican vaquero who'd turned to crime after his family's ranch was stolen by corrupt officials. Frank Dutton was a former Union soldier who'd deserted during the last year of the war, bringing military discipline to the gang's operations. Billy Crane was barely 20 but had already killed 3 men in gunfights, his baby face hiding a vicious temperament that made even his fellow outlaws nervous. The others were lesser known but no less dangerous. Tom Wheeler, a horse thief who could track a man across Bear Rock, Charlie Bass, a safecracker who'd learned his trade in the slums of New York, Jesse Polk, a gunfighter who'd fled Texas after killing a sheriff, and Henry Cole, a former preacher who'd lost his faith and found a new calling in violence. Together they formed a gang that was well-armed, experienced, and utterly ruthless in their methods. They'd robbed banks in 3 territories, stolen cattle from ranches across Colorado and Wyoming, and left a trail of burned buildings and dead men in their wake. The reward for their capture, dead or alive, had grown to $5,000, but no one had yet been able to collect it. Jake had faced down rustlers and claim jumpers before, but never anything like this. The smart thing would be to cut his losses, take whatever he could carry, and start over somewhere else. He was still young enough to rebuild, still strong enough to clear new land and raise new cattle, but the thought of walking away from Silver Creek made his chest tight with something that felt like physical pain. This land had shaped him, molded him from a reckless young man into someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the value of perseverance. Every fence post he'd set, every head of cattle he'd raised, every improvement he'd made to the property was a testament to his belief that a man could create something lasting through honest effort. The cabin held memories of winter evenings spent reading by lamplight, of quiet mornings when the only sounds were the creek flowing and cattle lowing in the distance. To abandon it now would be to abandon everything he believed about himself and the kind of life worth living. He'd spent 15 years proving that a man could make something of himself through hard work and determination. Running away now would mean admitting that all those years had been wasted, that the dreams he'd built were nothing more than illusions that couldn't survive contact with harsh reality. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jake began his preparations. He cleaned and loaded his Winchester rifle, a weapon he'd bought 5 years ago after wolves had begun troubling his cattle. The rifle was a beauty, with a polished walnut stock and a barrel that could put a bullet exactly where he aimed it at 300 yards. He'd practiced with it regularly, not just for hunting, but because he'd known that someday he might need to use it to defend what was his. His Colt .45 received the same meticulous attention, the familiar weight of the weapon in his hand providing a small measure of comfort. The revolver had been his father's, carried through the war and brought west when the family had moved to Missouri after the conflict ended. Jake had learned to shoot with that gun, starting with tin cans and progressing to rabbits and deer as his skill improved. He'd been a good shot since boyhood, when his father had taught him to hunt deer in the forests of Missouri. Those lessons had covered more than just marksmanship. His father had taught him patience, the importance of knowing his target and what lay beyond it, and the heavy responsibility that came with taking a life, even an animal's life. Jake had never had to use his skills against other men, but he understood that tonight might change that forever. He moved through the house, gathering supplies and ammunition, his mind working through possible strategies and defensive positions. The cabin was well built and solid, with thick log walls that would stop most bullets, but it wasn't designed as a fortress. The windows were large enough to provide good fields of fire, but they also made him vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Jake had always been a man who planned ahead, who thought through problems before they arose. Now he applied that same methodical approach to preparing for the battle to come. He moved furniture away from the windows to give himself room to maneuver. He placed buckets of water throughout the house in case the outlaws tried to use fire arrows. He loaded every weapon he owned and placed them at strategic points around the cabin. The barn presented both an opportunity and a problem. It was close enough to the house that he could reach it if necessary, but it also provided cover for attackers trying to get close to the cabin. After considering his options, Jake decided to leave the barn doors open and drive his horses into the far pasture, where they'd be safe from the fighting, but wouldn't provide the outlaws with valuable animals to steal. His cattle were already scattered across the valley, grazing in small groups that would be difficult for the gang to round up in the dark. Jake had learned from the mistakes of other ranchers who'd made the error of keeping their herds concentrated where they could be easily stolen. If the Garretts wanted his cattle, they'd have to work for them, and every minute they spent chasing livestock was a minute they weren't spending attacking his cabin. As afternoon faded into evening, Jake found himself thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment. He remembered his father's words about the importance of standing up for what you believed in, even when the cost was high. He thought about Sarah and wondered if she'd made the right choice in marrying a man who could offer her security, but not the kind of love that came from shared dreams and mutual respect. He thought about all the small moments that had made his life at Silver Creek Ranch worth living. The satisfaction of watching his cattle grow fat on good grass, the pleasure of a well-built fence that would stand for decades, the simple joy of sitting on his porch with Rusty at his side, watching the sun set behind the mountains. These weren't grand adventures or historic achievements, but they were his, earned through years of honest work and careful planning. Rusty followed him through these preparations, sensing the gravity of the situation, even if he couldn't understand its specifics. The dog's amber eyes were alert and watchful, and he stayed close to Jake's side as if offering silent support. When Jake knelt to scratch behind his ears, Rusty pressed against him, his warm body a reminder of the bond they shared. The dog had always been sensitive to Jake's moods, and now he seemed to understand that something momentous was about to happen. He moved through the house with unusual alertness, his ears pricked forward and his nose testing the air for scents that might indicate danger. When Jake checked the loads in his weapons, Rusty sat nearby, his intelligent eyes following every movement. As darkness fell, Jake positioned himself at the front window of the cabin, his rifle ready and a full ammunition belt across his chest. He'd chosen this position because it offered the best view of the approach to the house, but also because it put him near the door in case he needed to move quickly to another defensive position. The waiting was the hardest part. Jake had always been a man of action, someone who preferred to confront problems head-on rather than sitting still and worrying about them. But now he had no choice but to wait, watching the darkness beyond his windows and listening for the sounds that would announce the arrival of his enemies. Rusty lay beside him, alert but calm, his ears pricked forward as he listened to sounds too faint for human hearing to detect. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that he wasn't facing this ordeal entirely alone. Whatever happened in the hours to come, he knew that Rusty would stand with him, loyal to the end. The attack came in the deep hours of the night, when the moon was nothing more than a sliver of silver in the star-filled sky. Jake heard them before he saw them, the soft creak of leather and the muffled sound of horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth around his cabin. They were trying to surround him, to cut off any chance of escape before they made their demands. A voice called out from the darkness, rough and confident, with the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and violence. It was Samuel Garrett himself, Jake realized, recognizing the voice from descriptions he'd heard from other ranchers who'd survived encounters with the gang. "Morrison, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up, and maybe we'll let you ride away with your life. Try to fight us, and we'll burn you out and take your cattle anyway. You can't win against 8 men, so don't be a fool about this." Jake's response was to shift his rifle barrel toward the sound of the voice, though he couldn't make out a target in the darkness. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady when he called back his answer. This is my land, Garrett. I built it with my own hands, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let you steal it from me. You want my cattle? You'll have to come and take them." The silence that followed was heavy with tension and the promise of violence. Jake could almost feel the outlaws positioning themselves around his cabin, calculating angles of attack and preparing for the assault they now knew was inevitable. Beside him, Rusty growled low in his throat, his body coiled with the instinctive knowledge that danger was approaching. The first shot came from his left, a muzzle flash in the darkness that was followed immediately by the crack of splintering wood as the bullet struck the cabin wall. Jake returned fire instantly, aiming for the flash and hearing a curse from the darkness that told him his shot had come close to its mark. The battle for Silver Creek Ranch had begun. For the next hour, the night was filled with the thunder of gunfire and the acrid smell of black powder smoke. The outlaws fired from multiple positions, trying to keep Jake pinned down while they maneuvered for better angles of attack. But Jake knew his property like a man knows his own reflection, and he used that knowledge to his advantage, shifting from window to window and making each shot count. The cabin's thick log walls proved their worth, stopping bullets that would have punched through frame construction. But the constant impact of lead against wood filled the air with splinters, and Jake had to keep his head down to avoid being blinded by flying debris. The windows offered good fields of fire, but they also made him vulnerable to the crossfire the gang was trying to establish. Rusty proved to be more than just a companion during the fight. His keen hearing and sharp instincts allowed him to detect movement that Jake's human senses missed. And more than once, the dog's low growl warned of an outlaw trying to approach the cabin from an unexpected direction. When one of the gang members tried to sneak around to the back door, Rusty's fierce barking alerted Jake in time to shift position and drive the man back with well-placed rifle fire. The dog's courage was remarkable. Despite the deafening noise of gunfire and the obvious danger, Rusty never wavered in his determination to help defend their home. He moved through the cabin like a gray shadow, always seeming to know where Jake needed him most, providing early warning of threats and offering silent support when the pressure of the battle threatened to overwhelm his master's concentration. As the night wore on, Jake began to hear signs that his resistance was taking a toll on the attackers. Voices called back and forth in the darkness, and he caught fragments of conversation that suggested at least two of the gang members had been wounded. But his own ammunition was running low, and he knew that he couldn't hold out indefinitely against superior numbers. The outlaws were professional enough to maintain their positions and keep up steady pressure, but Jake could sense their growing frustration. They'd expected to overwhelm a single defender within minutes, not find themselves locked in a protracted battle with a man who seemed to anticipate their every move. The longer the fight went on, the more dangerous it became for them, as dawn would bring the possibility of pursuit by law enforcement. Samuel Garrett's voice cut through the darkness again, this time with an edge of anger that hadn't been there before. "Morrison, you're just making this harder on yourself. We've got all night, and you're running out of bullets. Surrender now and we'll make it quick." Jake's answer was another carefully aimed shot that sent sparks flying from the rock behind which Garrett was sheltering. The outlaw leader's cursing was audible even over the sound of ongoing gunfire, and Jake allowed himself a grim smile. If he was going to die tonight, at least he'd make sure the bastards remembered him. The turning point came when Samuel Garrett, frustrated by his men's inability to overwhelm a single defender, decided to try a more direct approach. Jake heard the thunder of hoofbeats as three riders charged toward the front of the cabin, firing rapidly as they came. It was a desperate tactic, but it might have worked if not for Rusty's intervention. The dog burst from the cabin as the riders approached, moving like a gray shadow in the moonlight as he attacked the lead horse with the courage of an animal defending his territory. The horse reared and threw its rider, who hit the ground hard and didn't get up. The animal's terrified whinnying filled the air as it bolted away from the battle, leaving its former rider sprawled motionless in the dirt. The second rider tried to wheel his mount away from the unexpected threat, but the horse was already spooked by the sounds of gunfire and the scent of blood. The animal reared and spun, presenting its side to Jake's position at the cabin window. The rifle shot took the rider from the saddle before he could regain control, and he tumbled to the ground with a cry of pain that was cut short by the impact. The third rider, Samuel Garrett himself, managed to stay mounted and continued his charge toward the cabin. But Rusty wasn't finished. The dog launched himself at Garrett's horse, his teeth finding purchase on the animal's leg and sending both horse and rider crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and thrashing hooves. Jake burst from the cabin, his revolver in his hand, and found himself facing the outlaw leader in single combat. Garrett was struggling to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead where he'd struck the ground, his own gun drawn and ready. For a moment, the two men faced each other in the moonlight, each knowing that only one of them would walk away from this encounter. The gunfight lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched like hours in Jake's perception. He saw Garrett's gun coming up, saw the man's finger tightening on the trigger, and knew that his own survival depended on speed and accuracy. His Colt bucked in his hand, the muzzle flash illuminating Garrett's surprised face as the outlaw leader crumpled to the ground. The remaining gang members, demoralized by the loss of their leader and facing an opponent who had already proven more dangerous than they'd expected, chose discretion over valor. Jake heard them calling to each other as they retreated, their voices fading into the distance as they rode away into the night. The battle for Silver Creek Ranch was over. Dawn found Jake sitting on his porch, Rusty curled up beside him, both of them exhausted but alive. The yard in front of the cabin told the story of the night's violence, with bullet holes in the cabin walls and 3 bodies that would need burying before the day was through. But the cattle were safe, the ranch was still his, and he had survived the ultimate test of his determination to hold on to what he'd built. As the sun climbed higher and painted the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Jake reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He could have run, could have started over somewhere else, but he would have spent the rest of his life wondering if he'd made the right decision. Now he knew. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to preserve. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later with a posse of 6 men ready to help deal with the Garrett gang. When he found Jake calmly going about his morning chores, with Rusty trotting along beside him and the bodies of the outlaws already buried on a hill overlooking the creek, the lawman could only shake his head in amazement. Marshal Tom Stevens was a veteran of frontier law enforcement, a man who'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, but even he was impressed by what Jake had accomplished. The reward money for the Garrett gang was substantial, enough to buy a lot of improvements for Silver Creek Ranch, but Jake found that the money mattered less than the knowledge that he'd stood his ground when it counted. Word of the battle spread quickly through the territory, and Jake found himself something of a local legend. Other ranchers who had fled their homes began to return, inspired by his example and emboldened by the knowledge that the Garrett gang was finished. New settlers arrived as well, drawn by stories of the man who had defended his ranch against impossible odds with nothing but courage and the loyalty of a good dog. Jake hired new hands to help with the cattle, men who understood that Silver Creek Ranch was a place where a man's word meant something and honest work was respected. The ranch prospered in the years that followed, growing from a single man's stubborn dream into one of the most successful operations in the territory. But Jake never forgot the lesson of that night, the understanding that everything worth having came with a price that had to be paid in full. He kept Rusty by his side until the old dog's final day, never failing to acknowledge the debt he owed to the loyal companion who had stood with him when it mattered most. Years later, when Jake was an old man with silver in his hair and grandchildren playing in the yard where he had once fought for his life, he would tell the story of that night to anyone willing to listen. He would speak of courage and determination, of the bonds between man and animal, and of the simple truth that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The ranch still bears his name today, a testament to the belief that a man's legacy isn't measured in the wealth he accumulates or the comfort he enjoys, but in his willingness to stand up for what he believes in when the world tries to tear it down. And somewhere in the wind that still blows across the Colorado plains, in the rustle of grass and the whisper of water over stone, the spirit of that night lives on, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to surrender to fear.